Do you want to learn TanStack Start? Are you having a hard time understanding the docs or finding good YouTube tutorials? I certainly found it a bit hard in the beginning. So for that reason, today I will be teaching you TanStack Start from beginner to advanced. We will learn everything ranging from the fundamentals of a TanStack project, how to create your first few routes, to more advanced topics like server functions and caching. Now, to efficiently learn TanStack Start, I actually recommend understanding the basics of React first. And there's no better place to learn React than through my new course platform, WebDev Ultra. Currently, we only have one course available, and it's the React.js Ultra course for beginners. However, depending on when you're watching this, my new Next.js course will be out. If you're interested in checking it out, just click the link in the description or go to webdevultra.com. Now that we got that out of the way, let's get into the video. Okay, everyone, so let's get started. Now, in order to get started with the TanStack Start project, there are a couple ways in which you can do that. For example, if you go to the TanStack Start docs, you'll see that one of the options they give is that you can choose over here a basic boilerplate repo that they provide you with, and you can install it into your project. You could also install TanStack Start with some of the other options that they provide. For example, you can install a project that just comes with just a basic project, which is what we have over here. This is the most basic option you can start a project with. You can start a project with TanStack Start that already has authentication set up. You can have one that is a basic counter project, so you can get an idea of what what TanStack Start is. One with React Query already installed, and so on. So they have a bunch of other options, and that's the thing. You would usually want to start a project with a lot of the stuff that you know is going to be in the project already set up. So that's why it's good for them to already have a bunch of examples over here. Now, another way you could do that as well is with this nifty command that will get you set up using TanStack Start immediately. Now, this command, I think it's great because it basically allows you to choose what kind of TanStack Start project you want to have without having to manually choose one of these options and clone it in your computer. Now, the command is create TS router app, and I'm going to install the latest version of it. Now, it's going to start asking us some questions. For example, what do we like to name our project? I am already with a folder, an empty folder opened inside of VS Code. So I want you guys to do that. So I technically want to name it nothing. I want to put a dot because that will create the project inside of the directory that we are already inside of. But if you want to make another folder inside of this, the project that you're in, you could do that. Now, it's going to ask us what kind of router we want to use. Now, TanStack Start uses, uses TanStack Router. And TanStack Router is a routing provider that is amazing. It competes with other routing providers like React Router and Next.js's App Router, and it is very similar in certain ways. It allows you to either use file-based routing, as you can see over here, or code-based routing. And the difference between them is, as the name implies, you can either define your routes with code by writing and defining them in a file, or you can just make files, and depending on the structure of their files, it will create the routes in your application. So we're going to choose file router because I personally prefer it a lot. And you guys will see that with TanStack Router set up in our TanStack Start application, it's going to make it extremely easy. Then it's going to ask us if we would like to use Tailwind CSS. I'm going to put yes. You can choose whatever you want. We're not going to be dealing that much with CSS in this video, so I'm going to choose yes. It's going to ask us for a toolchain. You could choose one of these. I have never tried Biome, but I obviously have tried ESLint countless times. My work, at projects that I build, I think it's a great tool as well. But it's not specific to TanStack Start, so I don't want to really deal with it. So I'm just going to choose it as none. Then here's the cool part. It asks us what kind of add-ons we want to add to our project. So we can build a project by default alone with nothing already set up for us, right? And that's fine. But with this command, it also allows you to choose different packages and setups that it will already set up for you automatically, so you don't have to do it all over again. It's similar to, for example, choosing one of these examples that they have on their website, where you can start a project with Supabase already installed or a project with Clerk already installed. But the good thing here is that you can stack them together. So obviously you're familiar with the different things here. Clerk, a great authentication provider. Convex, it's a type of database. TanStackDB is another TanStack product. We're not going to be dealing with it in this video. TanStack Forum, again, another product as well. You can choose any of these options over here and already have your project set up with it. I'm going to choose TanStack Query because I do think TanStack Query is huge for having a TanStack Start application, so we're going to be dealing with that. But other than that, I'm also going to choose TanStack Start, and none of the other options I think matter that much to me right now. When I'm done with that, I'm going to press enter, and it's going to ask us if we would like to use any examples. The only example that the command has right now is TanStack's chat. It's like if you want to have an example project so you can maybe take a look at it. TanStack chat is like a ChatGPT, I believe, type thing where you can like talk to an AI. It's cool to look at to see how that project would look like, but obviously we don't want to do with that right now. So immediately it's going to initialize a Git repository and it's going to start installing the project for us. So I'm going to close this up and we'll open up here on the left, and you see that this is what a TanStack Start project looks like. Now, right off the bat, you see that it is a very common looking project, right? If you're building, it doesn't matter if you're building a project using just normal Vite, which, by the way, it's the building tool that powers TanStack Start and makes it be extremely fast and makes it be as performant as it is. You see, it looks very similar to other projects, even a Next.js project. We have here our source folder, our public folder, all of our configuration files, and so on. But here in the source folder, this is where it gets interesting. So it already comes, because of the options we chose, it comes with some files and folders already set up. The first one is the router.tsx. Now, what is this router.tsx? Well, this is a crucial part of defining and configuring the routing in TanStack Start and TanStack Router. Like I said, routes using TanStack Router or set up using files. So we have here our routes folder, and every single file that we have here is a route. Now, depending on how you name them, they will serve different purposes. I think an important thing we can do right now is, since it finished installing everything, we can run our project to see what it looks like. So the script for running this project is over here. Obviously, if you're in development, you should run the dev script. So what we're going to do is we're going to say npm run dev, and it should create a project on the port 3000. And this is what it looks like. So you see, it comes with an empty project that has a navbar and some pages. It also has this thing over here. If you're not familiar with TanStack Query, this is and TanStack Router, every single package by TanStack comes with the dev tools installed. So it's pretty nifty because you can play around with this, debug your code with the different services that you're using. So this one is for TanStack Router and this is for TanStack Query. Obviously in your real project, this wouldn't show up. But let's see what this website does. So it has a couple routes. It has a home route. It has a TanStack Query route. It has a start function, server function route, and it has an API request route. This is great because it's going to make it super easy for me to explain to you guys a couple of the different topics related to TanStack Start. So these are all example routes for you to understand. You can delete them if you want to, and they are defined in this routes folder. So let's go over how routes are created in TanStack Start. So you see that we have here a route. And this route over here, if you're familiar with something like Next.js, this would be like the route layout of your project, right? It has here a component called route document, and it takes in children, and the children that it takes in, it's the components that are rendered for each individual route. Now, everything around this children call down here is what shows up no matter what. For example, you see that no matter which route we're in, we're seeing this navbar. Now, this navbar is a component, and this component is being rendered by this header component that comes by default on the components folder. Now, this header component has a bunch of UI that is showing up no matter which route you're in. And the reason why that happens is because we put, or the default code puts it above the children call. So it appears no matter what. If I were to write here, hello world, you'll see that now this will appear no matter what. So this is very basic. It's like this for all of the other frameworks out there as well. And you see that it includes spaces for you to put stuff, for example, your head tags. There's a component called head contact that it's already by default for you. And below there's as well the TanStack dev tools that I mentioned. If you want to remove it, you can do this, and then this thing will disappear. Great. Now, this is what the root document is. It also has this. This is the metadata that you apply for the head for your route. Now, we're going to get more into details about how to create a route, but it's great that by default, it already has some metadata for you. For example, you can change the title of your project. You can change some of the content information and so on. And this is the main purpose of the root file. Now, there's the index.tsx file, and this is not the same thing as the root. The index.tsx, the name index, since we're using file-based routing, this name represents the main route, the home route of your project. So you see that in here, it is rendering whatever we see here, which is what used to show up in like a Create React app, or very similar to that. And in here, you would put your home route. Now you see that throughout this app, there are a lot of parts of it in which we're getting some weird red squiggly lines, which means that there's some error. Now, why is there an error, right? If I go to the different files, you might see that there are some errors appearing on them. That is because all the routes in TanStack Start are type safe. Now, what does that mean and why does that matter? Well, what that means is that whenever you create a route, the existence of that route and all the configuration, parameters, all the kind of stuff that is related to that route will be type safe throughout your application, so you never make a mistake. And that's why this is an issue here. For example, if I go to the header component, you see we have some links, right? Now, these links all have a place where it takes you to. Now, a link, this is a component by React Router. Now, a link is a component from TanStack Start or TanStack Router, and it's similar to any other link component like in Next.js and so on. You might be used to this. And it just takes you somewhere. It's what we're clicking up here. Now, you see that as I start typing on this link, it gives me nothing. But it should, because TanStack Router is type safe. And the reason why we're seeing errors over here is because this is how you create a route in TanStack Router. You pass a path name over here, and you create a variable called route, and you pass a component to it. Now, the reason why it's giving red squiggly lines is because to make it type safe, which it is by default, we have to have a file called routetree.gen.ts. This file is created, and you might have noticed that it wasn't here before. It's created whenever you run your development server. If I click on this file, this error should go away because then the context of my code base will update and it will know that it now has the types. If I click on this, you see that now that error goes away. Why? Because on here, it has auto-generated types for all of the routes that we have in our project. And this is the coolest part about TanStack Router. If I were to come back and click on any of these files, you see that there isn't any error anymore. Now, how do we create a new route? That's one of the most basic things. And I want to go over a bit, just a crash course on the routing fundamentals. Well, for example, if I want to create a route, which is an about route, I would come here to the routes folder and I would create a file called about.tsx. When I do that, you see that it immediately creates a file for this route. And that methodology that I told you guys of creating a route, where you have to create this constant called route and use this create file route function, is automatically generated, so we don't even have to care about it. And it assumes that the route you're talking about is going to be the name of the file. So you see, it created a route with the /about path. So if I were to come over here and I were to do /about, you see that whatever we rendered over here should appear on that route. Great. So you see it is working. Very simple. So every route you create, it's like that. Now, what about something else? What about, for example, a dynamic route? That is something that is very useful and it's very common in any kind of application. Well, for example, if I were to create a user route, right, I would call it user.tsx, and this creates a user.tsx. If I were to come over here, we should see hello/user. But if I want to actually put a user ID as a param to this route, so that, for example, if I were to do user/3 or 4, it would show here some information, some UI based on what the ID of the user is. This is a very common pattern in web applications. To add params, you have to, after the name of the route over here, you have to add a money sign. Then you have to write the name of this param. You can call it user ID, you can call it whatever you want. I'll just call it ID. And then you put .tsx. You see, I just made a change to that route. But the file, the code definition for this route updated it as well. And it now created this route where it accepts the ID param. It's that simple. You don't have to do anything. You just change the name of the route and it will automatically change everything, including the type definition. Because every time you make any of these changes, this route tree.gen gets updated. And if I were to go to the user route that is now here, it has the ID as a param. It does it all for you. Now, inside of here, what we could do, for example, to get this param value is very simple. We call this hook called use params that we can import directly from this route variable. So I can say route.use params, and I'll have access to a value for this ID. Perfect. For example, I could say hello user with ID, and then just insert the value of the ID here. And you'll see that whatever we put up here will actually appear at the bottom. So params are simple in TanStack Start and TanStack Router. Now, what if you get to a route that doesn't exist? Like something like this. Actually, this would exist because we have a param here. So let me just do something like this. We see a not found. Interesting. What is this not found? Not found component that is rendered in this project. How do I change that? How do I customize that? It's actually pretty simple. If you go to the root over here and you go to the root component, inside of this object, you could apply, for example, down here, a not found component. And this not found component allows you to render a component here that could have some sort of UI. For example, this is a not found page, and whenever you get into a not found state, it would actually render this. Now, obviously, make it look a little bit better. Maybe pull this out and put it into a separate file, but it's as easy as doing that, and it actually works for individual components as well. If I were to come over here and I could apply a not found component for the user route. Now, what does that mean? For example, if I were to render here, if you were to get into a stage where you're in the user ID route, right? User/456, and you know that there isn't any, like there are no users above 10, right? So if you were to get to user 11, that's a not found page because this doesn't make sense. Well, you could actually customize a logic to handle that. For example, I can say, this is not a user page. This is the not found state for this component. Now, it's hard to get to that state because we never do, right? We never actually insert the state of being not found. And if I were to check here, if the ID is greater than 10, which obviously we need to confirm this is by a number, we need to transform this into a number because it is a string as a param. If it is greater than 10, then what we want to do is we want to call this not found function. And this not found function should turn the state of the page to be a not found, but it doesn't. It doesn't work. Why? Because for logic like this, you actually have to apply it in a special function called a route loader. And a route loader is one of the most important concepts in TanStack Start and TanStack Router. A route loader is a function that is called when a route is found. So when you go to a route using the URL and it knows it matches that route, it is going to call this function when the route is loaded. And this is supposed to make decisions for this route of either gathering data for the route to show in the UI, or for example, decide if the route should even be shown. Like for example, in this over here where we don't want to show the route, we want to send it to the not found state. Now, how do we access that function? Well, to do it, you go to the route definition and you access the loader function. Now, the loader function has one argument to it. It has an argument which is a single object with a bunch of helpful entities that you can use. For example, in this example over here, we're deciding if we want to show the page or not based on if the user ID is greater than 10. And the user ID comes from the route params, right? So a good example of a property that we can access on the loader function is the params of this URL. And this is great because in this case, we actually want to do that. So in here, for example, I could copy this logic over here. Instead of saying ID, I can say params.id because it knows the ID is there. And I can throw the not found state. And you see that when I refresh this now, it should actually show this is not a user page. If I were to get to something like 9, which is below 10, you see that it actually shows. So it's very simple for you to handle stuff like, for example, if you need to show this page or not. Imagine if you're in a situation where you only want to, you're in a route where you only want to allow authenticated users to go in. This could be a place where you detect to see if the user is authenticated and do something about it. And it's great because this is the introduction to the loader function, which is the next thing we're going to be talking about in this crash course. Now let's do something a little bit more complicated with this. So this loader function, like I said, it runs whenever there's a match in the URL with the correct route, and that is loaded. There are other functions, like for example, there's the before load function that is kind of like the same thing, but it runs before the loader. And also, if you were to do something like an authentication check, like I just said, it would be preferable that you do over here, because then you do an authentication check of the user and redirect them somewhere else even before the loader runs. But with the loader itself, it is really cool because it is the place in which most likely you want to add fetching data. It's loader because you're loading data, right? You're loading the information for this route. So how would you handle loading data here? For example, imagine that we were fetching data here right now. We're not fetching it yet, but imagine we did. And we got this response object here. Obviously, imagine that on the right side over here, we are fetching data. Right now, I'm just going to make it into an object as if it's already the result. And we get a user with the name Pedro. This is what we get back. We can return this response in the loader, and whatever we get back from this response that we're returning, we can access in our route. Now, how do we access that information? I can access it by using the route and accessing the use loader data hook. Now, this is going to give us access to this and whatever we get back from our loader. For example, I can say hello to user with ID and with username, and then access the data dot username. You see that now when I refresh this, we should see the username that I'm returning from here appearing on the screen. Now, this probably doesn't seem that cool. Like, yeah, what's the big deal about this? We're just rendering a string that we got from here. But this is mocking the idea of fetching data. But if we were to really fetch data, this is how it would look like. Now, to test this, we're going to be using the JSON placeholder API as an example. I think it's going to be great for the example of this video. If you go to jsonplaceholder.typecode.com, you can see that they have an API, a table with a bunch of endpoints. We're going to be using the users endpoint, and you see they only serve 10 users, so that's a great example. I wasn't even thinking about this when I started doing this, but you can make API requests to this endpoint. You get a list of 10 users, and you can actually get each individual user by making an API request to the specific IDs of those users. And if you were to get to something like 11, it returns nothing. So we'll handle that case as well. So what we want to do is we want to fetch data from this and display it in our component. How do we do that? Well, to do that, we have this loader. So I'm going to delete what we just created over here. And I'm going to fetch data inside of here by using the fetch API. Now, to do that, we're going to have to make this loader be an async function because we're making an API request. So I'm going to make this function into async, and I'm going to say const response is equal to await, and I'm going to fetch data for this URL over here. As a first example, let's fetch data from just one, like all the list of users, and then we'll go into detail. But when we get this back, we're going to want to get the list of users and set this equal to await res.json. And then in the end, we'll just return an object with the users that we got back from the API request. Great. Now, inside of here, let's delete this and let's say hello, and then say this is the user. And we know that this is the information we get back. So for each user, we get back a name, a username, an email, an address, right? Since this is a list, for now, let's just console log that information down here in the component to see if we get it back, or else we would have to do all the mapping and stuff. But we'll do the UI when we get into each individual user. But what I want to do is I want to delete the ID thing. I'll keep the data because we do need to use it. And I'm just going to console.log the data that we get back from this. And let's see if when we console log this, we're going to get the users from the API. So I'm going to go back over here and let's open up the console log. And you should see that we got an object. That's what we get back from this. Now, what is this object? It's an object with a users field, and it has an array of 10 users, which are the users from the API request. Great. Now let's make it such that it only fetches one user at a time. So that means it fetches, for example, we're going to pass the user ID in the end, and if we pass one, it should just return back this information. How do we do that? Well, we have the Params ID, right? We have that. So I can just insert that directly over here. But here's the catch. We want to fetch this data and handle cases of errors, cases of not finding a user, and so on. So I'm going to put the params.id here. And we should just get back one user. So I'm going to call it user, and I'll return back that one user. And for now, we'll just console log that data. You'll see that it still works. If I were to open this up, we still fetch the data for one user. If I refresh it, actually, you'll see now we only get one user, and depending on what ID we pass, we get a different user. But that's not all we want to do. For example, what happens if we now get to user 11? Yes, we do see an error page like this, but there's actually an easier way for us to handle this. If we didn't know that the max amount of users were 10, right? We know it because we look over here, but what if we don't? Then what we could do is we can check down here if there's no user that was returned back, which is the case when you go to a user that isn't in that list. And if we're in here, we were to throw the not found, then it still remains the same. Why does it still remain the same? The object is empty. The user is empty for sure because we are on user 11. So why does this happen? Well, it's because even though the object is empty, JavaScript might think this like an empty object is still true. So a couple ways of doing this is we know that each user has an ID. So what we can do is if there isn't a user ID, then throw the not found, and then it actually throws a not found. Great. But if it is user 9, it has an ID. So it does show that information. Now we can display that information over here instead of just console logging. For example, I can say h1 name is equal to user.name. Or actually, it's not user. We have to get the data. So data.user.name. And you'll see the name of the person. I could then add another h1 tag that would say age, data.user.age. Actually, is that not a thing? That's not a thing. So I'll just get the email. And we should see that information being displayed as well. Great. Now, there's a couple other things that are important over here. For example, what if during this request over here, there is an error? That's an important thing to handle as well. Now, the way we can handle this is before we destructure the JSON, when we get the response of the API request, we check to see if the response was not okay. This will tell us if there was an error. What we want to do is we want to throw a new error that says failed to fetch users. Now, what does that do? And it's kind of hard to simulate an error, but we're going to do that in a second. What does this do? It just throws a new error. But what does this mean to the user? What do they see in the screen? Well, if you throw an error in a loader, you can handle a UI based on that. And the way you do that is by adding an error component on the route. This error component takes in whatever error was thrown through this, and it handles by rendering a component inside of here. For example, I could add a p tag here that, and I'm going to make it red by applying some tailwind here. That just shows the error with the error message. So to do that, we just render the error message over here. Now, the error message could be an object. So you want to convert it into a string so that there's no issues. Now, we need to put a comma over here so that it doesn't give us an error. And how do we test to see if this is working? Well, I'm going to change this to, instead of saying if res is not okay, which means if there's an error, let's just for now pretend like it always has an error. And this is what we see. Error, failed to fetch users. Obviously put a better UI, right? Because you want to have a good user experience. Oh, I just realized I double wrote error, because if you turn a string into an error, that shows. So here, this is great already. Perfect. So you now know how to create a not found for a specific component, an error component for a specific component, and a loader. But what about while you're fetching data, right? While you're fetching data, something must show. I know this API request is pretty fast, but we need to show a pending state, a loading state. To do that, here it is. There's a pending component, and this is what renders as you're fetching data. So as you're fetching data, you can render here, for example, a p tag, or I would recommend adding a spinner. There's so many spinner UIs pre-made already, but I will add here a p tag that will say loading users. And you'll see that while it's loading, it should show for a brief second. It is not. Oh, I just realized we're always throwing the error again. So let me remove that. Let me refresh again. And damn, it takes forever to, yeah, it takes forever to see that. Yeah, it's a bit hard for us to see the loading state just because this is so fast. So, but just picture that if you have a slow project, or you have a slow API request, it would show this pending component. So now we kind of understand most of this stuff over here. There's a lot more that you could as well. If you look at the create file route and what it expects when you pass over here, there's so many things that you could. So I do recommend you checking the documentation, because it for sure will have a solution for every edge case that you need. Now, the important thing to understand is that this loader function over here, it actually exists on both the client and the server. Now, what do I mean by that? If I were to console log, you see how we're console logging the user over here, and you're seeing it up here, right? We see this object appearing on our browser. Great. What if instead I were to copy this and I were to put it over here? I want to console log the user, but I want to do it inside of our route component and not the, inside of the loader, inside of the route, and not inside of the component itself. It should be the same, right? Well, no. If you open up this inspect element over here and you open the console, you'll see that nothing appears there. So where is this console logging? Where it's console logging in the server. So you see over here in the terminal where we're running our server, it appears over here. Every time we refresh the page, it will appear over there. So it's this important thing about the loader that you need to understand, that it runs on both the client and the server, and that makes it such that it can do some client functionality, but it can't do all server functionality. And what is some server functionality that it can't do? For example, imagine you have a database that you're trying to maybe get data. Instead of making an API request like we did over here to an external API or to an API route, imagine you just had your database. I use Prisma a lot. People use Mongoose for MongoDB. There's Drizzle. There's so many other options. You couldn't access them over here to get the data, because this wouldn't allow it to work. To do that, you would have to use a server function. And a server function in TanStack start is like the name implies. It is a function that you know for sure only runs on the server. So it's a bit different from this loader where it runs on both technically, and you can't really write like really intense server only functionality in here, because sometimes this might run outside the server in the client. So that's why a server function is important. It's kind of like in Next.js, you were to create a function and then add the use server thing, right? This is not a Next.js tutorial, but if you're familiar with Next.js, this might help you understand. Now, we have actually already an example of it set up in our project when we installed this up, and it is this demo.server.-funcs. I'm gonna come over here. This wasn't me who made it, obviously. It came with the command that we installed, but I think it should help us understand, and that's what I'm gonna use it for. So in here, we have a file that has some errors, but it's not an error, just ignore them, even though it shows an error. And this is a page where you have here a little card with a list of groceries, or a list of to-dos that you want to do, such as get groceries, buy a new phone, and you can add a new thing. For example, clean my room, and when I click add to do, it should add that information. And when I refresh this, that information is still there. So in a way, it is doing something in the server. It's not just in the browser, because it keeps that information saved up. And obviously, it could run in the browser if you were using a type of storage in the browser. But in this example, we know it's in the server because it's the server function file, right? So let me explain to you guys what this is. Well, if we come down here, we see some stuff, some code that we're already familiar with. We see that to create this route, there's this route variable with a create file route, and we see that it has a loader. But this loader is a bit different. It calls this getToDo's function. We'll handle that in a second. Then the component that is rendered here is this component over here. It has a bunch of stuff in it. It has some UI, which is what we are rendering over here. And it also does some stuff that we're used to. Like, for example, we can get the list of to-dos from our loader by using the useLoader data, and we can render it somewhere else. Now, it also has this router call over here, this useRouter hook, and the useRouter hook is a hook from TanStack React Router. And if you're familiar with any other routing system like Next.js, React Router, all of them also have a useRouter hook. So I'm expecting that you're familiar with this. Now you can use this for getting information about a route or to navigate the user. For example, you could say router.navigate and then say navigate to, and then put like the home page. And you see that when I save this, it redirects us there no matter what we do. So it is for navigation. And it's being used here for invalidation. After you add a new item to this to-do list, we'll deal with that in a second and explain what that means. But the important thing here is, where is this to-do list? Well, if you go up here to the getToDo's function, you see that this getToDo's function calls another function called createServer function. Now, createServer function is what you're going to be using every time you want to create a function that only runs on the server. And it is great because with the createServer function, it's like a special API endpoint that you don't have to write twice. So for example, if we want to make an endpoint that gets the list of to-dos, right? In a normal scenario, you would write an endpoint, like in a route, which is a GET request, and it handles that information. And then in your component, in your client where you want to read it, you would write a fetch function to handle it, right? To receive it. And you would fetch that route again and specify that. In here, you don't have to. You create a getToDo's, a createServer function. You specify the method, and in the handler, you deal what does it mean to get the to-dos. Right here is, again, you run all of this in the server, which means that you could do stuff here. For example, you can write a direct query to your database tables and then just call this getToDo's directly in your component. You can do that. We don't have to call it in our loader. You could call it inside of the component, as you'll see that we are calling this addToDo, which is a server function, inside of here as well, right? We call it in here. See? So that's the main benefit of it. Now, in this case, what it's doing, it's calling this readToDo's function, which it actually it uses Node.js to read your file system. This is just an example that they created. There's a todos.json file over here, which you see has the list of to-dos. If I were to add something manually over here, like for example, add 4 and say buy a house. I don't think that makes any sense. But if I do that, and I put a comma over here, you see that now when I refresh this, the getToDo's will call the readToDo's, which will read from that list and should actually see the new information. So this is how this works. And this functionality over here of reading the file system works on this server. That's why it is important that we make this into a server function instead of actually putting it in the loader and reading it like we did in the previous example. Now, a server function is also extremely important for mutations. And mutations are, for example, post requests, update requests, and put requests. In this example over here, we have an addToDo. And what we do is we create a server function, and this time we specify a method to be post. In the previous one, we specified it to be get, and here we specified it to say post. Because what this does is it adds a new thing to our table. Which in this case, obviously, it's not a table, it's just this list. But in a real example, it would have a database table. Now, in here, there's two important things that are cool to understand. The first thing is there is a validator. And this comes built in with the createServer function, which allows you to validate what you are inserting, for example, onto your post request before you get to the handler. Because with createServer function, especially if you're in a post request, you can pass in some data, like this addToDo function. When we call it, we pass in a data object with a to-do. And that is the string that you wrote over here. right? That we get it from a use state, which by the way, you can call in this component because this component is running on the client. Now, when you send this to do, it will first get to the validator, which it will validate if this is a valid input. Now, in this example, it's just one string that we're sending, but in the validator, you could use validation libraries such as Zod or Yup to actually validate your information. For example, if I wanted to validate what we're sending here using something like Zod, it would look a bit like this. So obviously we don't have Zod installed, but if we were, and we wanted to validate that the to-do is a string with maybe a certain amount of characters, and we want to put an error message if it doesn't validate for that, we could do it like this and use the Zod validator with our schema to validate it before we get into the handler of this post request. Now let's delete that because that's not what we don't have Zod installed, and that's just for me to explain to you guys. Now let's get to the handler. In the handler, you write your logic and you may return data if you want to, which is what we do over here. And again, since this runs entirely in the server, this could make a request to a database. Now there's a different type of server function that it is also useful in TanStack Start. This is just a normal server function, and the main purpose of it is that it lets us run backend logic at runtime. Now there is another type of server function called a static server function. And this one is a bit different because it is not at runtime. It is actually evaluated once at build time. So it isn't at every single request. And that means that the result of a static server function is cached as part of our output. This means that during the pre-rendering of the route, the function will produce some data, and that data will be stored as a JSON file that can be instantly served to the client without ever having to hit the server again. Now, you would obviously use less static functions compared to server functions, but I think it's still important to mention to you guys because a practical use case of it would be like if you're fetching data that doesn't change that often, like if you are in a website that is an e-commerce website and you have a list of store items that doesn't change that often. I think like a list of products. Maybe you don't want to rerun the logic of fetching the list of products at every single request. So requesting that as a static would actually make it more efficient. And the way you do request that as static is by going to a server function and then just adding the type to be static. So static would make it into a static function, and it would have all the benefits that I just mentioned to you guys. Now, if I were to refresh this and making it still be static, look what happens. We have all that information, right? Now, let me add a new to-do over here. I just added a new to-do. Let me add another one. Where is that? Why is it not showing? It's because it is static now. It is at build time. If I were to get out of this route and go into the route again, still nothing happens. Now let me close our development server and let me run it again. Let's see what happens. Let me refresh this. Still nothing. Let me actually now come over here and delete this output folder. This output folder would have the output, like the build folder. I'll just delete that, and now I'm going to refresh this, and here it is. It actually has the information. So this is the main difference about this. When you want to have dynamic data, use the normal create server function. If you want to have static data that you don't care about, use the, not that you don't care about, but you don't care about it changing that often, use the type static because it's way more efficient and you don't have to keep hitting the server every single time. Now, one of the most powerful things that you can do with server functions is how you can handle what happens right before you actually execute them. So what I'm talking about is a middleware, and you guys know about middlewares because middlewares are very common in APIs. It's very common in other frameworks like Next.js and so on. And a middleware will let you wrap a server function with extra behavior that will run before or after the function itself. So there's many use cases of that. Think about it as like adding guards or helpers around our logic in here. For example, if we want to make sure that the user is authenticated before they can add a to-do, right? We can add a middleware that will check for that. And if the user is not authenticated, then the handler won't be executed. Now, how do you do that? Well, you can create the middleware anywhere you want in your project because a middleware can be very specific. What you could do as well is you can create over here a middleware file or a middleware files. or middleware's file. Sorry. So middleware.ts. And in this file, what you can do is you can import from TanStack start the create middleware function. Now, what does this function do? Well, with it, you can create a middleware. For example, let's detect to see if the user is authenticated before they can add a to-do. And to do that, let me actually remove all of the to-dos that we currently have, just because I feel like they are, it's kind of getting cluttered. I'll delete all of this. We'll refresh, and it should be empty now. Perfect. Now, in this middleware, I want to create a middleware function that will run before every single request here to detect to see if a user is authenticated. So I'm going to call it an auth middleware. This auth middleware, you could use it everywhere else in your app. And the way you do it is you call the create middleware function. It allows you to pass here a type for this. Now, the type we want to pass is that this is a middleware for a function. But you could also make a middleware for a request. Like if you want to request some data and you only want it to be authenticated, you could do that as well. Now, what you need to do next is you need to specify that this is in the server by using a function. And in here, it allows us to pass a callback function that we're going to make it async. And as per every single middleware that you might be familiar with, it actually provides to us a function called next. Now, if you're not familiar with middlewares, I'll explain what next is. Next is a function that you'll call when you're okay with the request. So a middleware stays in between an action being taken or a request being requested. And calling the next function basically tells the middleware that you're okay with that request or with that functionality because it just moves forward. So in here, what we want to do is we want to check to see if the user is authenticated or not. Now, in a real scenario, if you're using, for example, a library, you would call a function here. You would say if not auth, maybe there's a function called auth, I don't know. And this function should check to see if the user is authenticated. Then what you do is you throw a new error. This error will say not authenticated. Please log in to continue. Something like that. If the user is authenticated, we call next. Now, just so we can test this out, I'm actually going to create this function here called auth. I'm not using any particular auth provider, but again, you would check the cookies, you would check to see if the user is authenticated. And in this function, it's a helper function that literally gives you a 50% chance of you being authenticated or not. So we can actually test it out. Now, we call this auth function over here. If it is not true, we'll throw the error. If it is true, like if the user is authenticated, then we need to return next. And that means it will move forward with whatever request we have. Now we're going to export this auth middleware and we're going to call it wherever we want to detect if the user is authenticated or not. For example, if we want to make sure that whenever the user adds a to-do that they are authenticated, before the validator, we can add a call to a middleware. And it's not just one middleware. You can pass a list of middlewares over here and it will run all of them to check to see if it's true. Now, in this case, the middleware we want to run is just to see if the user is authenticated. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pass an auth middleware over here and it should actually detect that. So let's try this out. I'm going to try to add something over here and it seems to have worked, right? It seems to have worked. We added the information. Yeah. Now let me try adding more. Clean room. Okay, it worked again. I'll just keep adding until it fails. Okay, so I added a bunch of stuff and you might think that it isn't working. It is working, but 50% for some reason for me seems like it's 80% working, 80% not. It does work. You'll see if I open up the server here, we got a bunch of server error, not authenticated, and we have to handle that error, of course, so we'll do that. But let me delete all this information over here and let me show you guys a little bit more. If I were to make the auth function, I'll actually, it can only be above 90%. That's when the user is authenticated. Then you'll see that if I refresh this and I were to clean my room, it's very unlikely that this will work. I'll click the button, yeah, and nothing worked. And if I open this up, it should have shown a not authenticated error. So it is working. It is detecting that information. Now, how would we handle that server error and actually demonstrate it to the user? Well, because it is a server error, the way we would do it is when we call the server function, not in the server function itself, when we call it over here, for example, in the submit to do, this is where we call the add to do server function, we would add a try catch. So I'll add a try over here, and I'm going to add a catch. And in this example, I'm going to just alert a message. Actually, no, I'll just alert a message. But imagine you would have like a snack bar that would show up, or a text over here saying that there was something wrong. In our case, we'll just say error.message, and it should show. Now it gives us, and it says there's an error, but that's just a TypeScript error, so I'm just gonna ignore it for now. And let's try adding this. So I'm gonna add a new thing, clean my room, and I'm expecting that it should alert something. And yes, it does. It not only alerts something, but it also alerts exactly the error message that we put on our auth middleware. So this is how you would handle this. And again, you can do this for other stuff as well. If I were to put this, for example, this auth middleware onto our get request, or get to do's over here, this server function, you'll see that this is what's going to happen. I'm going to pass the middlewares over here, and you would put the auth middleware over here. You'll see that now when I refresh this, it would indeed handle the error that we are dealing with. Now, obviously, in the scenario where I'll do this like 10 times, there's going to be a time where it does work, right? Yeah, there's a time where it is authenticated because we made it 90% chance of it not being authenticated. And what I was going to say is, I think checking for middleware for your authentication, it is good to do it here, but it's also good for you to do it in the before load function of the route. So it doesn't even show the route, and it doesn't even need to reach the get to do's. So here's what happens. This get to do's server function is being called on the loader, and this is where we're putting the middleware, and that's where it checks for authentication. But you can actually run the authentication before the load, and that would make it such that you don't use save requests that are unnecessary because you already know the user is not authenticated. Okay, so now that we understand what server functions are, what middlewares are, and how to fetch data and load it into our components, I want to start integrating one of the most important parts of using anything TanStack related, in my opinion, which is TanStack Query. TanStack Query is the first TanStack library out there, and it is one of the best libraries in the React ecosystem. And I don't think it makes sense to use TanStack Start without actually using TanStack Query. So we have here an example route that already comes with a project called TanStack Query that we can use to actually see and understand how to integrate TanStack Query into the project. Now, one thing though, it's already set up by using the commands that we used. It already set it up for us. So like if we were to go to the router.tsx, you see that it already generates a TanStack provider and passes to all of our components. It obviously does all the other stuff that we talked about. Like for example, if we go to integrations here, it has a dev tool set up for TanStack Query, but we want to see how to actually integrate it into the project as per how do we fetch data and use that data and cache it using TanStack Query. So here is an example. So we have here this route called demo.tanstackquery.tsx. It is this route that we have at the top over here. And you might notice that this route is pretty much the same thing as this route that we had before. Why is that failing again? Oh, it's because of the non-authenticated. Let me actually go back here and just remove that so that we can just see it as an example. I'm gonna remove the middleware from here. Perfect. Let me refresh this. Okay. So in the demo.tanstackquery.tsx, this is the same to-do list type thing. You can add a to-do here, and it will add it to the thing. And if I refresh, it will keep it there. Now, the main difference is that you might notice we are using TanStack Query through the use query hook, use mutation hook, and so on. So if you're not familiar with TanStack Query, I have a crash course on it. If you want to check it out, it's one of the best ways to fetch data, handle caching, handle the server state of your application. So I highly recommend that you get familiar with it. But to integrate it into TanStack Start, it makes it, in my opinion, such that your components are more well organized. But you might also notice that most of the logic is not present in this place. So the reason for that is because when you're going to, for example, fetch data for the list of the to-dos using the useQuery hook, you're not actually using a loader like we were before. There's no loader in this route. You actually use the useQuery and you fetch the data directly from an API endpoint. An API endpoint in TanStack Start is known as a server route. So you might be familiar with something like this from Next.js. But where does this API endpoint exist? Well, to create an API endpoint in TanStack Start, you create a route that starts with the word API. So you see these two files over here are TS files. Both of them are server routes. And you see that specifically the one for fetching the to-dos from this list is on this page over here. And this is what this route will look like. In this example, we have just a simple list over here of the to-dos. And this is what is being rendered over here. And then to create a server route, you call the create server file route. You put the endpoint path name and you call the methods function. The methods function allows you to specify get, post requests, put requests, patch requests, whatever you want for this specific endpoint. So in here, it creates a get request for the to-dos endpoint that just returns a JSON with the to-dos from this list. It also has a post request to add the to-dos, and all it does is it just pushes one more to-do to this list. It's as simple as that. And then if you want, you need to make sure that you always create the server file route inside of an API file. And then wherever you want to fetch this data, you can fetch it by just fetching directly from this path name. And then you'll get the JSON back. And with the useQuery hook, you can just assign this to the query function in the useQuery, and you'll get the data in the data. Now, why would you want to do it this way compared to doing it like we were doing it over here, where you pass the data through a loader and you handle it this way? So first of all, you might notice that it's a lot more organized to do it. Why are the files keep disappearing? Let me just open it again. Perfect. In this way over here, it's more organized, in my opinion. It looks more clean, right? But also, there are some actual direct functionality reasons why you might want to use something compared to the other. So for example, when you load your data into your page using a loader, this will run on the server first. We've talked about this, how the console log consoles on the server. This will run on the server first when the route is requested. And then they can block the entire route from being rendered until the data is ready. And the important thing to understand is since we run that loader in the server and we get that data when the route is loaded, that means that the data is SEO sensitive and it is great for things that don't really change that often. We've talked about the difference between dynamic and static. I would say think of this as like something like if you're used to Next.js in the past, something like a get server-side props. Or if you're just used with nowadays, just getting the data and loading it in a server component. And when you're using something like a TanStack query, it's a bit different because this is more for dynamic data. This is fetched, the data is fetched in the client side after the hydration. So this is great for stuff like when you have a live feed, you have dashboards, you have things that are constantly dynamic, interactive, and changing, because you also get a lot from using the useQuery. The useQuery hook gives you direct availability for caching, refetching, as you can see, retries, deduplication, all that kind of stuff. And it is very handy for that reason. So I personally think that the best thing you can do is you can leverage the benefits of both different methodologies the same way how you, when you're building a Next.js application, you would be leveraging the methodology of using a client component and a server component. There are benefits for both of them. In here, I would use loader information and loader data for whenever I need to focus a lot on server-side rendering, SEO, data that again doesn't change that often, or if I don't need any client-side caching or refetching by default. And I would also use TanStack query for anything that would require dynamic information, would change a lot, and so on. A common pattern is to actually combine both of them in a way that you can actually have a use query in a route that has a loader, and you just use the use query hook for anything that is not fetched when the route is fetched, so it's something that is fetched later. Now that's the basic idea of using TanStack query in TanStack Start. Now in this video we are doing a crash course, and as per what you need to learn for getting started with TanStack Start, I think that this is more than enough. With this, you'll be able to create different routes in your application. You'll be able to handle loading data in your application, mutating data in the application, doing that both in the client and in the server, being able to handle middlewares, leverage middlewares that will prevent users from accessing a route that they can't, or an API endpoint, or an API function that they can't. And that's, in my opinion, more than enough. Now, if you want to understand how to organize and the best practices of, like, building your project, I would say that TanStack Start is still very new. And I've mentioned this in the beginning of the video. It's still very new. So it's the kind of thing that, in my opinion, you can work towards yourself. I think the best thing you can do if you want to learn TanStack Start is just start building it. Just start building applications with it. Maybe delete all the initial files that come with it and start building your own app. And you'll slowly start feeling how to organize the project in a better way. Obviously, depending on what you guys think of this video, I might create a video where I build a very large application using TanStack Start, so you guys can get an idea of how I am building my TanStack Start applications. So let me know in the comment section down below what you think, if you think that this would be a good idea, and I'll help you guys out. Now, before I end the video, if you are thinking to yourself, damn, maybe this TanStack Start stuff was a bit hard, and that's because you don't have the full grasp of React yet, I would recommend you checking out my React.js Ultra course for beginners. It is currently in my own course platform, WebDev Ultra. I'll put the link for it in the description. If you're interested, just go and check it out, and I think you would benefit a lot from it. So thank you so much for watching this video, and I see you guys next time.